the topic for this episode is what is binge eating. And I was thinking about this morning in the shower, as I do. That's my moment. That's when my brain comes to life. And I was thinking about what is binge eating. But when I think about it, I feel it before I articulate it, before I can make sense of it. When I think of binge eating, it's that feeling of being out of control around food, feeling powerless, feeling on edge, this like vigilance around it all the time, and feeling like when I'm in that binge, when I'm in that, don't come near me, don't interrupt me, you can't stop me. Nothing's going to get in the way of me having this food. And so when I think of binging, I think more of the feeling of how it used to show up for me.
It's interesting that your mind went straight to what is the felt experience of binge eating, because my mind went, there's two routes we can go down with this. This might be like the therapist in me of thinking like, what is the clinical definition of binge eating? If you were to pick up a textbook about eating disorders, what would it say? And then there was the route of, but what's the lived felt experience of it? I think the felt experience is really not represented in the clinical definitions. So I don't know shall we start with like the definition of what it is? So I guess it gives us a place to go from of what it is, and then
Yeah, I'd be interested to know actually.
shall we Google it? Shall we DSM-5
I
it?
was going to say, are we in DSM-5 it, Becca?
It's quite catchy, isn't it, actually? So the DSM-5 is going to have a description of bulimia and a description of binge eating disorder, which both contain a binging element, right? Binge eating disorder has many different criteria, but it categorizes an episode of binge eating as eating in a discrete period of time, usually within a 2-hour window, an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in a similar period of time under similar circumstances. We can look at the subjectivity of that in a moment if we want.
Yeah.
And the sense of lack of control over eating during the episode. So feeling like you cannot stop or you can't control how much you're eating, which I think that's quite a fair summary. Then it also says binge eating episodes are associated with eating more rapidly than normal, eating until feeling uncomfortably full, eating large amounts of food when not feeling physically hungry, eating alone because you're embarrassed of what you're eating, and feeling disgusted with oneself, depressed, or very guilty after overeating. It also includes that there's got to be a marked distress from the binge eating. And then for it to be classified as binge eating disorder, it says it either has to be 1 day a week for 3 months for it to be classed as a disorder. And what I didn't know, actually, until having a look here, is that it actually can be marked in severity. And then 1 to 3 episodes of binge eating a week is classed as mild. And on the
Really?
higher extent, 14 or more is classed as extreme, which, well, someone who's had binge eating disorder and bulimia, I don't think having 3 episodes a week felt mild.
Absolutely not.
Oh, and here's the biggie to determine between bulimia and binge eating disorder. Binge eating is not associated with inappropriate compensatory behavior, such as purging, fasting, vomiting, laxative use, excessive exercise.
So it doesn't obviously speak of the mental restriction.
No, doesn't talk about restriction in any way. And this is quite interesting because when I've read a lot of like clinical books around binge eating disorder, they talk as if binge eating disorder exists without any restriction. And from my lived experience, many people I know and have worked with who have lived experience, that is simply not true. Restriction is often at play.
Yeah.
Suppose it's just not classed as an inappropriate compensatory behavior. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear you.
The other thing that's quite interesting here is there is a lot of similarities between bulimia and binge eating in terms of how they describe a binge eating episode. But in the definition for bulimia, it says self-evaluation is unjustifiably influenced by body shape and weight. But that doesn't exist for people with binge eating disorder, according to the DSM-5. And again, I don't personally agree with that based on my lived experience and working with people who have binge eating disorder.
The bit that always throws me, that always makes me feel a bit sticky with it, is marking things in severity. I
Mhm.
always find that a bit tricky because I think it's putting things into a category and I just think there's nuance. And I think you then fall into the risk of, which was a similar experience when I first struggled with anorexia, of you have to reach a certain point, even for yourself, whether it means you invalidate the struggle that you're going through or it limits your availability to getting help. That always feels a bit icky for me because a binge is distressing in itself and I'm only having 3 a week. So I'm mild, but experiencing such distress about it, I don't know, it can be quite tricky. What do you think?
No, I agree with that. And that was a new kind of realization for me from reading that here. Interestingly, on the bulimia description, in terms of severity, it says that the severity can be basically increased or changed to reflect other symptoms or the degree of like functional disability, so how it's affecting someone. But it doesn't say that for the binge eating disorder definition, keeps it as fixed numbers. I'm not someone that likes to work in numbers at all. Like when someone says, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? I find that really hard because your 7 and my 7 could be completely subjective. So I don't particularly like that severity part of it either, because I think that's someone could experience one binge episode a week or one binge episode every 2 weeks. And that still can be really distressing and really
Mm.
impact that person's physical and mental and emotional well-being. And I also agree with you that it can make people feel like, oh, if I'm only in quotation marks experiencing it once a week, then it's not as serious.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
agree. Then I think you leave the window open for things to just progressively get worse
Hmm.
before you feel like you could maybe explore getting help or even understand what it is that you're going through and your experience. So let me ask you, Becca, when did you realize what was going on with you in terms of binge eating? How did that play out for you?
I started with bulimia first.
Yes.
Then it went into a very restrictive phase and then it developed into like binge eating disorder. So I think I became aware quite quickly that this was not a healthy coping mechanism for me. Or I think I was aware quite quickly that there was something not right for me here. And I think that's largely because of the purging side of it. And I'm trying to be really careful with how I say this because I really don't want anyone to leave this episode thinking that bulimia and self-induced vomiting is worse than binge eating disorder. I don't think that at all. In fact, actually, I found the binge eating episodes the most distressing thing of all of the disordered eating I had. That was the most distressing thing. But I think there's a such lack of awareness around binge eating, and I think the term binge and binge eating is often misused or misunderstood, or it's minimized, that it can be harder to really acknowledge because of the narrative we have generally in society around binge eating. Whereas I think in society, the idea of self-induced vomiting is very much acknowledged as like a flag to recognize that something is not quite right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You make complete sense, Becca.
Thanks.
When I was in recovery, that was when I realized how much the restriction was a catalyst for the binging. I didn't appreciate it at the time. And it was the physical restriction and the mental restriction continuing that binge restrict cycle that we get stuck in. You just feel like you're chasing your tail with it. You're going round and round. I was trying to think, was there times where I was binging? There were times where I was binging and there definitely wasn't physical restriction going on. And my depression was really bad and it was literally get up, binge, back to bed. So there was no physical restriction, but the mental restriction, the way I was talking to myself afterwards, that was absolutely perpetuating the cycle. Yeah.
Do you know what? As you say, that just made me think that you said, oh, there's no mention of mental. Bleh. You said there's no mention of mental restriction in there.
Mm.
But actually, if you look at those definitions, a lot of it is behavioral based, isn't it?
Mm.
Which is really interesting considering it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. We're talking about mental disorders here, but using behavioral symptoms to classify them.
Yeah. And you know what? It does say in the what is it?
DSM-5.
D Start again. It does say in the DSM-5 about, because I was waiting and for the point where they would talk about the way that you feel after, because that's such a huge
Mhm.
factor, I think. And that kind of touches on the mental restriction, like the shame and
Mm.
the guilt that you feel, but it's not spoken in a way of it being a catalyst for binging.
Yes.
It's interesting the way that you say it's talking about the behaviors. And I think that leads people to feel and believe like the solution is to change the behavior. I just
Mhm.
need to change the behavior. And it's just far more complex than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask, because you speak about binge eating, you speak about your restrictive phase of anorexia. Did you ever experience bulimia?
No, I didn't. No. Although I say that, Becca, there was definitely not long before I recovered, I was obsessively exercising as a way of purging.
It's so tricky because I think about this in terms of when I had bulimia and when I had binge eating disorder, what was the difference there? When I had bulimia, I self-induced vomited
Mm.
and I would use laxatives. So they would be the compensatory measures. Sometimes I would try to compensate through exercise, but I don't know if it would have been classed as inappropriate compensatory behaviors. So when that self-induced vomiting and laxative use dropped off, the binging was still occurring. That was binge eating disorder, but was I trying to compensate in any way? Well, probably. I was always trying to control my body
Mm.
weight and I was always trying to lose weight. So I was eating in a way that was restrictive and I was exercising in a way to make up for something, the kind of the mentality of if I exercise, then I can eat this, that kind of thing. So what is the difference? Where do we draw the line between limiting our food intake being
Mm.
inappropriate compensatory and when isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It's quite hard to make that definition. And the same with exercise. And the only thing I can think of for myself from having had those two lived experiences is when I had bulimia, the restriction or the exercise would probably not have been classed as, I don't want to use this word, but quote unquote normal by what society would deem as normal. Whereas when I had binge eating disorder, the next day, the restriction of food intake or the exercise would have been classed as normal by society, as in just that's a normal way of eating. That's how people just generally eat or exercise if they're on a weight loss journey. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I've worded that well.
Yeah, I actually just want to say that I really wanted to try not to use the word interesting because I think I say that far too much, but I'm going to go with it because I can't think of anything else right now. But when you were talking about purging and laxative use, my brain was like, Katie, you used to abuse laxatives. I used to do that. But my brain, when you said bulimia, was like vomiting. That's immediately where my brain went. And I just wanted to say that because it's very easy again to try and fit us into these brackets. And actually, there's far more to bulimia than being sick. There's other ways in which you are engaging in these behaviors. So I just wanted to say that. This is the thing, isn't it? It's really difficult to try and define and put people's lived experience into a category, isn't it?
So difficult, because what we've been talking about here a lot in these definitions is objective binging. And there's actually an objective binge and a subjective binge, isn't there?
Yeah.
And if anyone has read Christopher Fairbairn's book around binge eating disorder, he talks about subjective binges and objective binges from a clinical perspective. So then if we start to throw in a subjective binge, it gets even messier, doesn't it? An objective binge is, quote unquote, what anyone would class as an excessive amount of food. And I think that's what it's alluding to in this description where it says, let me see, an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat in a similar circumstance. That's objective. It's talking as if that's a truth universally.
Yeah.
Whereas a subjective binge is when somebody feels like what they've eaten is too much, or they've perhaps felt out of control, or like they could not stop with that food. However, from the external point of view, that food might not have been a really large quantity within that circumstance, or just might not have just not been a large quantity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
That's
so
what I was
tricky
gonna
because then
say.
we start to bring in that nuance and that personal side of it, but in a clinical kind of definition and format. So it's very messy, isn't it?
It is. And I think it always, to me, what made the binging feel like binging, feel like something that was wrong, was the way it felt. And I think as well, even now, so long as your behavior around and with food is interfering with your life, is causing you distress, then you have every right to address that. Because I look back and I binged for so long, but the binges looked different in that time period. Like there was times when I was in very much immersed in toxic fitness culture, that macro counting era where you have cheat days and people were posting on YouTube like 10,000 calorie challenges. Do you remember that? They would do that and I would sit and watch it because I was like living through these people eating all this food and wishing and always thinking like I could do that easy. So my binges then, although I knew in my gut that they felt out of control and I would white knuckle it to the weekend when I could have a cheat weekend, which is what I classed it as in order to try and make myself feel okay with it and make sense of it. But the whole day, from the minute I woke up Saturday morning to when I went to bed on Sunday evening, I was pretty much just eating. And if I wasn't eating, I was thinking about food and I was trying to get food. And that was what my weekend was. And in that period of my life, I don't think maybe it was in the beginning, the eating wasn't necessarily frantic because I felt like I had earned it because I'd been strict in the week. But it was still this, I was eating a lot of food and it was more than anyone else around me was eating. And it was from the minute I woke up to the minute I went to bed for 2 days. I'd have looked at the DSM-5 at that point, would I have looked at that and gone, nah, I don't have binge eating. This is fine. I don't fit that. This is fine. I made sense of it, even though this isn't feeling great. Like I'm not liking this. I'm aware that come Sunday, the thought of having to not eat like this and have to make up for this doesn't sit well with me. And yet that's what I'm doing. I would have looked at that description and thought, no, that's fine. This is just 80-20. This is fitness balance. This is just balance, isn't it? It was out of control. It just looked a little bit more refrained than how it did when I was much more severely physically restricting and over exercising, and that felt far more like tunnel vision for food. Like you could try and shut me out of the kitchen and I would knock that door down kind of urge.
Mhm. That's a really good point to make. That kind of we've spent some time talking about the definition because I just think it's helpful to use that as a starting point and to have some discussion around it. And I understand why these criteria are created.
Hmm.
Because if we're going to create a healthcare system where people get support, we have to look at how do we determine what support someone needs and things like this.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's a perfect system and it doesn't mean the definition is perfect, but I think that's so helpful probably for people to hear because, yeah, by definition, that probably wouldn't have been classed as binge eating or binge eating disorder because if we're thinking about an amount that's larger than what people would consider in a similar circumstance,
Mm.
actually within that fitness culture, that was quite normal to restrict Monday to Friday and then at the weekend, eat whatever you want, go wild, have whatever you want in whatever quantities. That so that wouldn't have been classed as abnormal there. Actually, abnormal is not a very nice word, really. That wouldn't have been classed as something that's different. What's the word I'm looking for?
Don't ask me. I use the word interesting like 8 times in a day.
That wouldn't have been classed as disordered.
You got there.
Yet, your experience of it, it felt disordered.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
I
it,
have actually been given advice from fitness professionals before. Scarily, one fitness professional who actually worked within an eating disorders unit within the NHS, and this is why I reached out to him, who basically encouraged that and said that's what he did himself. Yeah,
that is worrying.
it is worrying. And I don't think he's the only one,
He
the
won't
only
be.
person.
He won't be.
Mm.
I think I saw a post on Instagram, or was it on Threads? I don't really go on Threads, but I think it was on Threads, and someone was saying like people in the fitness world really need to make sure they are aware and distinguishing between what is overeating and what is binge eating because they are two very different things. And if someone comes to you and they are binge eating, they probably don't need a fitness coach at that point. They probably need a different kind of level of help. And I think they are used interchangeably, as I said at the beginning. And I know what I was doing in that time was definitely binging because I was eating loads of food. But I told myself, as you said, this is health and fitness. Check me out.
Hmm.
Everyone's doing this. I'm doing what I should be doing. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, it was definitely far more toxic than I realized at the time.
During that period of time, those weekends, those binge long weekends you had, did you feel out of control with food? Did you feel like you could stop? Did it feel like it was a conscious decision on or not? Where were you with that, do you think?
I remember, I have this distinct memory of being at my boyfriend at the time being at his house, and it was a Sunday morning, and Saturday we'd eaten so much food. I'd eaten so much food, like it was a go to the shop and buy everything kind of thing. And my side of the bed was up against a wall, and there was a window and a windowsill. And I remember waking up, and I hadn't even opened my eyes. And I lifted up my hand and I grabbed a handful of Maltesers from the bag and I just started eating them. And like I hadn't even opened I'd been awake for less than 30 seconds. And I remember thinking, this isn't good. This is the first thing you've thought of as you've woken up in the morning. You can't even let yourself get up or have a cup of coffee or have a shower, anything like that. You're going straight for the food. And so, although the eating wasn't frantic like it later evolved to be, if my boyfriend had turned around to me and been like, let's just have a cheat day on Sunday, let's just eat normal on Saturday, I would have felt this, don't you dare take this from me. I think I was in denial of how out of control I felt around food. I really made it okay in my head. And it was like day-long binges of just constantly putting food in my mouth all the time. And if I wasn't putting food in my mouth, I was thinking about it. Yeah, although it wasn't necessarily a frantic energy behind it, I didn't want to stop. I told myself that this made sense, but I don't think I was in control of it at all.
Mm. I think my experiences were a bit of a mixture, but the frantic binges were more predominant for me. As you were speaking then, when you said if he'd said, we're not going to have a bingey day or a cheat day, as it was termed at the time, on the Saturday, but we will on the Sunday, the word that came up for me was like rage. I
Yes.
remember experiencing, not in terms of the frantic binges, but these binges that we're talking around. If I decided that day I was going to be like, fuck it, all the rules are out today, and someone didn't want to go to somewhere to get food with me, or say
Mm.
we'd agreed to go and get like a burger and chips, and then they were like, I'm not really feeling it. Oh my God, there'd be so much rage in me. Like, why do you not want to do this with me? Like, I couldn't, I would want to force that person to do that with me.
Hard relate, Becca. Hard relate. Yes. Yes. When you're in when you're in a relationship or you're surrounded by people who have, for want of a better word, normal relationships with food, and they'll take or leave a takeaway on a Saturday night or chocolate this, that, they can say yes or no. And the absolute, like, I can feel the rage in my chest. And you can't even make sense of it, can you? It feels like someone is taking something away from you. We'll talk about that another time. But it's don't you dare take this from me. This is mine. This is my thing. I need this. I can't not have this.
Do you know what it also makes me think of? This all or nothing mindset that's often there when binge eating is there. Because when I made a decision on those days that I'm not following the dietary rules today and it's going to be a cheat day, that would be the all or nothing mindset kicking in. And if someone didn't want to partake in that with me, I couldn't process that. It was like, no, but that's what today is, because tomorrow is going to be back on the rules. And it almost felt like I was being betrayed by someone, feeling like, no, I've thrown out the rules today. So this is what we're doing. And if you're not doing that with me, then you've tricked me, you've conned me. I should have been doing my rules today then, if we're not going for it fully. And it speaks to this, that or this. And don't put me in the middle somewhere, because I can't do that.
Yeah, I only know how to restrict and be on track, or I'm so far off the track that I can't even see the track. There's no other way. You become accustomed to just being in extremes of it. And the way that you're talking about it, it's not interesting, don't worry, I wasn't going to say that. But the way you're talking about it,
But it is.
it's also how there's something about other people participating in this with you that really tries to lessen it. It's not the way I want to say it. I want to say it like, if someone else is partaking in this with me, then surely what I'm doing isn't this bad thing that I shouldn't be doing. If someone's eating like this with me, then it's okay. I don't have a problem. It's like in recovery, one of the most surprisingly challenging things for me was having dessert when my partner wasn't having dessert, being the one person to eat. And the ways in which we're trying to make this okay, this behavior okay in our heads. I don't know where I'm going with this, Becca.
I guess
Scrap it.
I feel like you're saying it normalized it for you and it justified it.
I'm gonna reword it then with those words.
I feel like this is partly one of the reasons why things like these 10,000 calorie food challenges, programs like Man versus Food, mukbangs, all of that. I am speaking from my personal experience here. I think that's why they've become so popular. In some ways, obviously, there's many reasons why they're popular, I'm sure. But I remember watching them and getting so much satisfaction out of watching a Man versus Food episode, to the point where I was like obsessed with watching them, like really obsessed with watching them. And I wonder if it was because it made me feel like it was okay. Like I felt less alone in what I was experiencing, and watching someone else eat such, because some of these man versus food programs, I don't watch them now, and actually I find them uncomfortable to watch now, because in some of them he would be really forcing a lot of food down, and you could visually see how distressed he was in his body putting himself through that. And there was something about watching that that made me think, yeah, it's okay that I do that. He does it on TV, so it's okay that I do that. Obviously, not the same circumstances at all, but I do think there's something there about what you're saying in that justifying it and normalizing it.
Yeah, I totally forgot about man versus food. But as well, and this was another part of the binge eating. When I say binge eating, I guess also just encompassed within disordered eating is that I was forever watching cooking shows, baking shows. Like if there was people coming over, I was baking so I could give them the food. Like I was always thinking about food. I was so preoccupied to some degree of being around food, watching the what I eat in a day videos. It was like it would give me a temporary feeling of satiety. I thought if I watch someone eating all this food, I can convince myself that I've somehow eaten all this food and it's going to stop me wanting to binge. It felt like it was a way of trying to trick myself. When I word it like that, it sounds really ludicrous, but it did. It was like living through these people eating foods that I felt I shouldn't eat and I wasn't allowed to eat, as a way of trying to soothe that part of my brain that wanted the food, in the hopes that then I would just be able to act normally around it. Does that make sense?
Hmm. And did it?
No, never. It made it worse. It made it
Mm.
worse because it actually, as well, put more like types of food into my head. It made me much more aware of food, even more so than I was. But it just pushed me further
Hmm.
into food because it was all I was thinking about, as your body does when it wants food. But it was obsessive, without a doubt.
Hmm. So we've spoken quite a bit about this type of binging, which is more normalized in society. What about the more frantic binge episodes that you experienced? Did they feel the same? Did they have the same kind of energy behind them, or how were they for you?
So, in my early 20s, after the fitness side of things, I don't quite remember, but I definitely wasn't doing the macros and things like that. And I was dealing with depression, which was really taking over. And I spoke about it a bit in the beginning. That was a period in my life where I was getting up to eat and then go back to bed. But the binges didn't feel frantic, but the way I feel like when I talk about it, it's not going to make any sense. But for anyone who may listen to it and have a similar experience, it's worth talking about. It's like I was exhausted and I didn't even have the energy to eat. And yet there was something about the binge that felt like it was giving me something. And it was a lot of food, a lot of food. It wasn't frantic, but it felt like this was all I can do with myself. This is all I have the energy to do. And then I would go back to bed and I would sleep. And that was a period for quite a long time before I went on medication, which helped. When I try and describe it, when I tried to describe it to my partner before, it just feels like this black cloak over me. And so being on medication just lifted that a little bit and it enabled me to get moving again. And that was probably the darkest time that I've had with binging. And I think what scared me the most is I didn't care. Like I didn't care. I didn't really care. I got to a point where I was like, I'm not even fighting this anymore. I felt awful in myself and I just let that be. And then the period of time where the binges were really frantic, that was the few years before recovery. And that showed up a lot for me when I would come home from work and you couldn't hold me back. I was always very conscious, but it was pushing food down, can't have enough, and feeling like my stomach was going to explode, and yet I couldn't not eat. That was the cycle that I got into of binging in the evening and then restricting the following day to make up for it, and then binging again. And that felt scary. Those binges really scared me. And they became more and more frequent to the point where it was every day, sometimes multiple times a day, just in this perpetual cycle of restrict, binge, and feeling no matter how much I eat, I'm never hitting this wall. I'm never hitting this point. I'm normally running out of food, and that's what slows me down. But feeling so powerless in these moments, so out of control, and so scared of myself. What is wrong with me here? And just really internalizing that and carrying that. It went in periods, but it was over a few years, and then it was exasperated even more in lockdown, which I think we've talked about, with over exercising as well, which just shockingly made it 10 times worse. But what about you?
What you said there is you can't relate a lot to the, like those numbing kind of binges because there was always like this real hyper awareness to what you were doing. Firstly, that made me think I can't relate to that as much. I think there were times when there was some times where I was aware of it, but I do relate more to that completely checking out. Being aware of it until in the build up of it, but very much feeling like I checked out and coming back round afterwards. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but I just want to say that made me feel like that must have been so hard for you to be hyper aware of what you're experiencing, but feel powerless because there isn't even that kind of, I've completely checked out, I'm not even registering it anymore. You're still the whole time witnessing the out of controlness.
Yeah, I think apart from when I experienced the binging when I was depressed, I don't know if the binging, the frantic binging, never felt like any kind of escape for me.
Mm-hmm.
It never felt like it was offering me respite, really. And yeah, apart from when it was the depression side of things, when it felt much more numbed. Yeah, I think feeling like you're very aware of what you're doing then feels then I should be able to stop. Like, why am I not stopping? Why can't I just put this food down and walk away?
So that feeling, I relate to that in the build up. So my experience of these big, frantic, objective kind of binges was feeling, so they usually happened at home for me. There was two kind of ways I binged. I remember I would have binges at home on my own, and I would also have a lot of walking binges. That's what I would do. I would just walk around city I was in and binge. There was probably more awareness to the walking binges, but these binges that I experienced at home, they were the full on, absolutely checking out kind of binges. And every time a binge came about, I think it was physical and mental restriction always at play, but there was often like an emotional charge behind it too. So that could have been a lot of emotional overwhelm would be driving it. And it would feel like I could feel it coming. And that was where the awareness was. And it would feel like this is going to sound, I hope this is going to make sense to people. And I'm sure if people have experienced binge eating, it probably will. And if it doesn't, if people haven't experienced binge eating, they might not relate, but that's fine. It would feel like there was this vortex, and that vortex was the binge. And it would feel like I was getting pulled and pulled into it. And as I was getting pulled into it, there was like this me pulling back, but that was not enough. There was some kind of force that was pulling me into it. And as that was happening, there would be this like foggy kind of hazy feeling fall over me. But when you look at like a picture that's had some kind of like hazy, foggy effect on it, that's how like the world would look. It would feel like that was what was happening to me. And I'd been being pulled. And in that moment, I would be so aware that this was happening to me, but feel like I could not control that happening. And my brain would be like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Just don't walk into the shop. don't go into the shop and buy what it is you're going to do. You're here now, there's a shop, just don't do it. Walk past the shop. But that would never happen. It would almost just be like, I remember describing it as a demon entering my body and taking over. And that's when the trance would just hit in, and I just feel like I had no control over what I was doing at all. And I'd buy whatever it was, and I'd go home, and I would just consume copious amounts of food. Like the amounts of food that I would consume in a binge was really big, like huge. And once I started to eat, it was like almost as if once that food touched my mouth, it's when I checked out. That was it. I was gone. And I don't really remember much of those periods of time during the eating itself until food had gone, or until the food had gone and then I'd fallen asleep and then I'd woken back up, or in my purging days, the food had gone and then I'd purged and then I'd come back out. And after I'd come back out, that's when that fogginess would lift, the trance would lift. There wouldn't be that hazy feeling anymore. And I would actually feel often quite alert. Maybe not if I'd binged and come out of it straight away, but if I'd slept and then come out of it, or I'd purged and come out of it, then I'd actually feel quite alert. But that alertness was not like a nice alertness. It was like a real, I'm really hyper aware of now what's just happened. And I've got to clean this up. I've got to clean up whatever mess is around me from having done that. And that's when they just complete and utter disgust and shame would kick in. And it would still be quite a frantic alertness because I'd be wanting to get rid of all evidence as soon as possible. I didn't want anyone to accidentally come back and find that, or I just didn't want to be caught out. And the shame of feeling like someone could see that was horrible. Yeah. And that's how it would felt. That's how those frantic binges felt for me. The difference between the walking binges is all of that feeling would be the same. However, they would be more like, instead of it being one huge quantity at once where I'd completely check out, that feeling of the haziness, the fogginess, being pulled in, eating it would happen. But I'd go into the shop and I'd buy a couple of items. And then I'd walk around just in a trance, in a daze, eating it until I'd come towards the end of whatever it was I was eating. And then I'd feel that sensation of being pulled into something again would happen. I'd get pulled into the next shop. I'd buy something else. I'd walk around in a trance eating that. And that would just repeatedly happen until I don't know. I'd often do this, like, say I was going from like work to home, that might be the journey that I would do. And it would be like an excessively long journey until I eventually got home. And then I'd get home and I'd probably still have my evening meal with my partner. And there could potentially be another binge later if it wasn't going to be on my own.
I have to say, the way you make complete sense, by the way. Let me start with that. The way that you talk about that pull and that resistance, that like fight back of no, I will not. And yet you just can't, no matter what. It just pulls you in. I so relate to that. I think a lot of people will. Even when I think about that feeling now, I'm like, no wonder I couldn't fight that. Like, it was so strong. It was so strong. And I think over time, I don't know whether you experience it like this, but over time, you're just tired. Like, it's harder to fight it. I would find that the frequency of the binges was increasing. There was less time in between them. And I definitely reached such a level of exhaustion where I wanted to stop, but you just get tired of it, of that pull. And I would say as well, like even the restricting afterwards, that became harder and harder. That urge, there's a reason we can't just stop that urge. It's far more than anything to do with self-control and willpower and discipline and all of those words we like to use to push ourselves into better behavior. The way you described it was really helpful for me, actually. I really relate to that. Thanks, Becca.
You're welcome. And to anyone else who's listening that may relate as well. I think those real big binges where it's a complete checking out, I view that as it was a dissociation. I
Mm,
was dissociating from the world around me,
yeah.
from myself, because these started around the time of the trauma I experienced. And I
Mm,
really do see that as a way of trying to just completely check out of that. Like after some of the trauma I'd experienced, like especially the sexual trauma, I remember just feeling like I did not know what the world was anymore. I didn't trust the world. I didn't feel safe in the world. I didn't trust my body. I didn't feel safe in my body. I didn't feel like I was in my body. Like I didn't know what this body was anymore that I was in. And I really feel like it was a way of shutting off from that feeling. And and I think that can also work in a sense of emotional overwhelm as well. I think that emotional overwhelm can become so strong that binging can serve that purpose to just check out from it. Like almost for me, it felt like it was like, this is my off switch. Can't deal with this anymore. Can't deal with these feelings. Can't deal with these emotions. Whatever. This is my off switch. I just need to check out. And that's what it served. And I think it's important to name that these behaviors like binge eating and purging, they develop because there's some purpose. We are getting some benefit from it at a certain point in our lives. And at that point, in my life, I didn't feel safe in my body or in the world. And it did provide some kind of feeling of safety and it helped in that way. But it didn't mean it was like a healthy thing for me to do. And over time, that feeling of safety did start to flip on itself. Like I started to actually feel unsafe from the binges because I felt like I had no control over what was going on and I didn't know how to stop it. So the role they played in my life changed, but I just really want to name that because I think people can think, why am I doing this? What's happening? I think there's an important piece there to have compassion about where they develop from and what your body or your mind, however you view it, because some people view it coming from the body, some people view it coming from the mind, to really it's trying to help you in some way. And it's for some reason come to the solution of binge eating being being that way of helping you.
I'm really glad you touched on it like that, and that you also spoke of it through a trauma lens, because my binging in relation to trauma, for me, the binging was like this hypervigilance, like it didn't feel safe to switch off,
Hmm.
to shut down. Like I felt like I needed to be aware of my surroundings at all times.
Hmm.
And food for me felt like pushing down the emotions. I had to push it down, I had to keep it down because I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to speak to that in the way that, similar to how we talked about it in the beginning, in terms of the diagnostic criteria, in that there's so much to this. Binge eating is serving a need. It may not make sense to you, it may not make sense to you in your logical mind, your rational brain, but it's serving a purpose. And this is why I think one of the first steps to recovery, or even exploring recovery, is figuring out what purpose it's serving for you. What need is it meeting? Because I think as well, it gives you a different perspective to look at it, in that, okay, so if my binge eating is doing fill in blank for me, then trying to just take it away, you're asking a lot of yourself. That there's a reason there's resistance here. There's a reason that you can't talk yourself down or force your way out of this. So I'm glad you spoke of that, because I think it's really important, and we'll absolutely do an episode on that.
I think that would be really helpful to look at the reasons why we binge for sure. And I think it is important to mention these things from a trauma lens, especially given my experience and how linked it was to trauma. And along that line, I think when someone has experienced trauma, we become so dysregulated in our nervous systems that actually it can be really hard to know what safety is for us anymore. And it can be really hard to sit in that middle area, that we become so used to the highs and the lows, the extremes, when you are really dysregulated in your nervous system. And I think that binging and purging, in my experience, fell in, served a bit of that purpose, because there was a high. I was getting a high from the binge. I was getting a high from the purge. Then it was followed by a real, real low of a crash of all of that shame and disgust. And then you'd sit there for a bit, and then you'd go back to this high of the binge and the purge, and then you'd slump back down to the low. And it's not comfortable. It's really distressing, and it's really traumatic to live in that state. It's exhausting. It's so much for your body and your mind to take. But that middle area can sometimes feel so inaccessible when you have to the point of that level of dysregulation.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Because I would say for me, although I had the momentary high from binging, I think I got more of a high from restricting. And the binging felt more like a low for me.
Yeah,
It
it's
went,
interesting.
but you become accustomed to living only in the highs and the lows.
Mhm.
So I can remember even when I started recovery, there was a part of me that maybe didn't necessarily want to give that up because I don't know, there's something about it. I remember thinking like there's nothing's going to match that high that I get
Mhm.
from
Yeah,
restricting. Nothing's going to beat these highs that I'm getting. But they feel higher because of the low lows. That's what makes them feel like that.
yeah.
But anyway, if I'm not careful, I'll totally go off on a tangent about a different topic that we can save for another day because I think we're probably, I didn't check the time, but I think we're probably at time.
I think we're at time,
I
probably
think we're
over
at
time.
time, way over time.
And I think we are verging into another topic there. But what would you, just to wrap up, what do you want someone to take from this episode? Obviously, people can take whatever they take because it's their personal experience, but what would you want to put out there as a takeaway?
I think the main thing I would like to say is that please don't let the fear that you don't fit into a category or tick all of the boxes stop you from reaching out for help or reaching out for support, or at least, at the very least, believing that you are struggling with some form of disordered eating or eating disorder. Because fundamentally, the bottom line is if it is impacting your day to day life, then you deserve to have support and help in order to navigate your way out of that. And I hope this episode has been really helpful to hear us talk about our different experiences and the way they relate and the way that they are different, and that
Mhm.
we both still struggled and came out the other side, and that we are just two of many stories. Sorry,
Yeah,
we are just two of many experiences. I'm just hoping it allows people to think, yeah, okay, maybe I do need help here. Maybe this is something I'm dealing with. That's enough for you to get help.
yeah. I think that's a really good point to make about if you don't fit the criteria, what you're experiencing is still massively valid. And I'm not going to go too much off on one here, but I think in the NHS, we predominantly provide CBT therapy, and they do use these sort of systems of criteria. However, that's not the only type of therapy that's available or the only way of um, viewing it. For example, if you were to reach out to person-centered therapist rather than a CBT therapist, person-centered therapists tend to lean away from diagnostic criteria and using labels, and they tend to focus more on just what is your experience, your personal experience. And I just want to put that out there because I don't know if that is as commonly known. And I think it's important for people to be aware that not everyone is going to view it through the lens of a criteria. Even professionals who are here to support with these things don't
Yeah.
necessarily do that either. And for me, I think one of the things would want to leave there for people on this episode is thinking, can you have some kindness to yourself for what you're experiencing? Because we've sat here and shared our experiences of what binge eating was like. And I can look back at that now and have a lot of kindness for myself, but I really couldn't at the time. And I'm wondering for people listening, as they were listening to this and to our experiences, what did they feel towards us? What kind of emotions did you have towards me and Katie about our experiences? Because they probably weren't really harsh, horrible thoughts towards us.
We hope.
Hopefully, hopefully not. But I mean,
Please
like,
don't let us know if they were, because we don't need to know that.
what kind of feelings did you have? What towards us when you heard us share those experiences? And can you extend some of that to yourself? That's what I want to know.
I like that. I
You know what?
really liked that point. Becca, I thought that was a lovely way for us to finish this episode. Thank you so much for your time. It's greatly
Thank you.
appreciated. It's
Thank you,
been
the listeners, as well. It's also perfect timing because my headphones are about to die of battery.
perfect timing. Thank you so much for listening. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know your experiences. We'll have our email in the description as well if you wanted to reach out and have a chat.
Which is podcast.onceuponabinge@gmail.com. I remembered it this time.
Yay! And I'll put it in
Wait.
the description anyway as well. But thanks for listening. We hope you found this episode valuable and helpful. And we will see you in the next one.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.